Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 3 of the FAFO Academy Podcast. And today we will be talking about how many people confuse confidence with competence. So let's dive in. Especially online, with the age of social media we are in and are experiencing as a society right now in the 2020s, because social media rewards certainty. It doesn't reward accuracy. And this is a huge talking point because too many people believe what they see on TikTok to be newsworthy, to be actually based in fact, when in fact, much of the content on social media is not even based in fact. It is solely opinion based, or they are facts that have been manipulated. And being able to discern the difference is very important because nowadays it seems as though we have the new Gen Z generation consuming TikToks and considering it to be news, when in actuality, even a lot of the news that we have, for example, on CNN, is manipulated. It may be factual, but it's manipulated through a specific lens. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how loudness is often mistaken for expertise. And real competence usually looks like being boring, controlled, and cautious. And there's this central idea that people who actually know the least amount of information or about the subject they're talking about actually sound the most certain. So again, we're going to discuss how you can discern the difference. So, but basically, confidence can be faked in seconds, but competence usually takes years to build. So let's start with social media, okay? So platforms definitely reward appearance over proven capability, okay? So for example, I don't consider myself bad looking, but I also don't consider myself above average in a sense. I'm just not bad looking, right? But that doesn't mean that everyone thinks I'm good looking or vice versa. However, the reason I say that is because if I was 20, 25 years old and I was female and I was busty, okay, and I could show a little cleavage on these podcasts, a lot of followers would simply watch or listen because they thought that I was hot. So that is an example of what I mean. Looks and appearance have a lot to do with it, and it can cloud the viewer's judgment a little bit to thinking, wow, this person actually knows what they're talking about, when really it's because the viewer just likes what they're looking at. So motivational culture rewards charisma, and appearance has a lot to do with that. Algorithms reward certainty and emotional reflections. And people mistake aesthetics for authority. Like I just said, nice camera, nice editing, expensive lifestyle, aggressive delivery. Real world environments expose weakness quickly, but social media does not. So business gurus, get rich quick schemes. These guys never run payroll a day in their life. They've never had more than one employee themselves. Or fitness influencers with no coaching experience. Because listen, that's a big thing with these fitness gurus. They basically, I don't know, they'll record themselves working out and they'll take their shirt off and they got these six-pack abs. Well, let me tell you something about that. A lot of that is fantasy based, okay? Because really, unless you want to cut a lot of weight or you have that body type, so like you're that ectomorph body type that just doesn't hold a lot of body fat, chances are you'll never see those ab muscles. And that goes for women or men, but I mean, normally it's men. I have six-pack abs. Well, there's a good chance that I have a six-pack, but you can't see it because it's under a thin layer of visceral fat. And honestly, that's how it's always been. I've never been fat, but I've never had a visible six-pack. And honestly, just because you have a visible six-pack doesn't mean you're in good shape either. So there's a lot of common misconceptions like, hey, this guy's a fitness guru because look at his body. But that is their body type. Or they could be taking supplements, they could be taking steroids. Even if they're natural, and even if what they're doing for their own routine works for them, doesn't mean it's going to work for you. So again, just because they have the charisma doesn't automatically equate to being competent, okay? So a lot of tactical influencers with no operational background. So I'm not one of those guys, but a lot of guys in my industry, and I say a lot, meaning more than half, teach because they can't do. And that is a big saying in the firearms teaching industry. Well, he's a teacher, he's an instructor because he can't do it. Or you have that instructor who will just do a mag dump in front of their students at close range. Say, hey, look at me, cool, I can squeeze the trigger really fast and hit the target. But in actuality, you were 3-4 feet away from the target and you couldn't miss. So that's not competent. I've had students ask me, I want to see you do it. And I will take the firearm from them and I will do it. And that is competence, people. That is what you need to be, is competent, not just confident. And you need to make sure your confidence doesn't exceed into that egotistical level either. So, bottom line is, with the internet and social media, it lets people rent their authority without earning the competence. So why is real confidence usually quiet? Well, because actual confidence is something internal and rarely requires performance. So competent people don't constantly prove themselves. Like, for example, when I begin a class, I don't shoot the qualification because I don't have anything to prove to the students. The students have to prove to me that they're competent. Same with the teacher. The teacher doesn't pull out their college transcripts and say, well, hey, here are the grades I got in school. This is why I'm competent to teach this. They just do it. So calmness often comes from repetition and experience. So real confidence asks questions, evaluates risk, while staying emotionally controlled. Now, insecure people tend to overcompensate with arrogance, being egotistical, overly aggressive, or constantly self-promoting, right? So basically, the loudest person in the room is actually usually trying to convince themselves. So why real experts speak carefully? So when I teach and I'm asked questions, if I'm taking questions at that point, because I don't like to interrupt my classes with questions. So usually I write them down, or I basically assign a person to keep track of the questions during a lesson. And then at the end of that particular lesson, If the question hasn't been answered, because 9 times out of 10 it has been in some form, then we'll go back and we will address that question and we'll answer it. So when I'm answering a question, I am increasing the awareness and the certainty of my competence with my students. And that is an important thing. So beginners tend to think everything is simple, ABC, 1, 2, 3. But experts understand the variables, the liability, and the consequences. And that's another reason that I just don't rapid fire answers to questions, especially hypothetical ones in self-defense situations, because I don't want to give some advice that could come back and bite me or my companies in the ass in court later on, subsequent to a self-defense shooting, because someone came to me and took my class. So that's a reason why real expertise inherently creates caution. And if it doesn't, it should. It should. But you have to be careful not to be too careful. So for example, a lot of doctors, especially in the United States here, be like, well, your foot hurts or you have a foot issue, go to a podiatrist. Something wrong with your head, neurologist. Something wrong with your nerves, neurologist. Something wrong with your heart, cardiologist. You get the point, right? It's that a lot of these frontline doctors, so your regular run-of-the-mill MDs, okay, whether it be emergency medicine, internists, or your pediatricians, or your regular practitioner that you go to for your annual checkup, they can handle a lot of these things, but they typically don't. They like to pass the buck, and that is essentially for liability reasons, because there's risk involved. Even though they probably are competent to treat a foot infection, for example, they'll refer you to a podiatrist, for example. So the more responsibility you carry, the more careful you tend to speak. So again, example I just gave for firearm instruction. So if I have students asking, well, what happens if? We always have a lot of the if-then questions. So in the age-old one, well, what if someone's trying to rape me? Can I shoot him and kill him? Well, at least in Virginia, it's a common law thing. So it's essentially very basic. If your life is in imminent danger, so basically imminent means right now, like in the second. If you have to think about it, then it's not imminent. So if your life's in imminent danger, so you're in danger of grave bodily injury or death, then technically, yes, you can stop the threat using lethal force. However, with rape, it's a horrible thing, but rape in and of itself usually doesn't fit that definition, because rape is not actively killing you. However, there's case law on the subject, and typically, if a woman uses lethal force against a man forcibly raping her, that's considered to be justifiable self-defense. And in Virginia, there's 2 different levels: justified and excusable. So we do not have a stand your ground state here. I'm not going to get into that in this video. Again, it's different from a state like Florida. Okay, well, first of all, Virginia is a commonwealth, and that's part of the reason that we don't really have stand your ground. But if you have no fault in the fray, then you do not have to retreat. You have no duty to retreat. Whereas in Florida, essentially, you could go pick a fight, and if the other person ends up pulling a knife and you shoot them, that's completely justified. But in Virginia, there's a separation between excusable and justified. It's a little bit more complicated. So regardless, experience replaces certainty with precision. And those are some of the things that I've just talked about. So when my students, for example, ask these questions, well, we have to break it down. What's the difference between excusable self-defense and justified self-defense, fault in the fray, duty to retreat, and is this hypothetical scenario likely equivalent to perfect self-defense or imperfect self-defense? And bottom line is going to be, I'm really not going to be able to say for sure with 100% certainty whether or not, if that actually played out that way in real life, that you would or would not be arrested, and that you would or would not be convicted by a jury subsequent to that arrest if that's what happens. So we just have to prepare people for, I suppose, the worst possible outcomes. So again, that is actually also part of dealing with compliance, because, operational reality destroys fake confidence quickly. So speaking of compliance, we have to have many licenses. So let's see, I have the federal firearms license. I have the special occupational taxpayer tax stamp. We have to submit annual reports because we're a manufacturer. And we have license with the Department of Criminal Justice Services, and we have certification from the Department of Criminal Justice Services. We also have other licenses in other states to run security. So just off the top of my head, the business has to have, and this is just one of my businesses, has to have 5 federal and or state certifications, licenses, all at the same time, just to continue what we're doing. And then that doesn't include what we have to register, for example, with the Virginia State Police for the full automatics. And it's funny because they can't technically be registered to a person. They can't technically be registered to a company. They have to be registered to a person, even though they're company-owned firearms, because the feds and the state have different guidelines. So essentially all of the full autos that we have, according to the federal government, are completely under the control of the company. But as far as the Virginia State Police are concerned, yes, they're under the company, but my name is personally on those. So I assume some kind of personal responsibility for those, because that's just how Virginia law works. So also with the customers, liability, other instructors, training director, assistant training director, safety, logistics, payroll, regulation. I just talked about that. So there's a difference between range confidence and true competence, okay? And why handling firearms around cameras differs from operational responsibility. And in this industry in particular, mistakes have consequences, and they could be deadly. So basically, people online tend to simplify things they've never actually managed, and it's easy to sound like an expert until responsibility enters the equation. So let's move into the danger of performative expertise. This is a major issue in the firearms industry, especially because honestly, we have many incompetent firearms instructors out there. In fact, I know one in the area, in this Fredericksburg, Virginia area. I won't mention any names, but they are completely incompetent, but yet they own and operate a training school. And honestly, they couldn't shoot their way out of a paper bag. So that is problematic. But yet they hold themselves out to be this expert. Now, they may possess the knowledge, and they may look good, and they may sound good while teaching. But if they can't do it, at least in this firearms industry, I think, personally, that's an issue. For example, back in 2000, I think it was 17 or 2018, so almost 10 years ago, I ran myself through the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services private security armed qualification for armed security officers. And I recorded myself doing it. I broke it down for students, and it's still on there on YouTube. I think it's got a decent amount of views. And it's one of the only videos out there that actually show what you have to do. And that's only if the instructors that you're taking it with actually call the course right, because a lot of instructors don't even call the course correctly. And honestly, the way that Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services has outlined the course online is pretty, I'm not going to say it's stupid, but it could have been put out there in a more simple form, and it hasn't been. A lot of these firearms qualifications I would consider to be borderline stupid. I had a student years ago came in, I believe it was for some type of ICE qualification to be Homeland Security. And I had to study this qualification on paper first because it just wasn't really making much sense. So anyway, long story short, this qualification in particular actually has the student end up with one live round in the chamber and basically an empty mag. And I'm thinking to myself, why the hell would a qualification end like that? And it was very weird and inconsistent with the magazine changes and everything. So anyway, I broke it down. It was a private training session, but I spent like 40 minutes breaking it down, and I rewrote it so that it could actually be understood. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, as a systems guy I am and the analytic guy I am, there's no way that even 50% of instructors are calling this qualification correctly. They're not, because you literally have to study it in order for it to make any sense. It just, so, and again, there are qualifications for firearms to test competence, okay? That is a test of competence, but it's only one test of competence, right? So that doesn't mean that you're competent overall. So in business, firearms, finance, relationships, leadership, politics, there's these echo chambers that can reinforce incompetence, and online status can absolutely exceed real capability. So basically, performance can attract attention, but competence sustains reality. So last thing we're going to talk about is why experience tends to humble people. So real experience tends to reduce ego, okay? Because failure teaches nuance, responsibility changes perspective. Competent people like myself have seen real-world consequences of incompetence in action. And the more you operate in the real world, not just on paper, not just in theory, the less simplistic your thinking becomes and the less emotional certainty you'll project onto others. So essentially, reality humbles people way faster than criticism ever will. And a point to criticism is they say all criticism is negative, and they teach us in this industry to use the sandwich method. Compliment, then your criticism, and then another compliment. So you kind of sandwich it. But all criticism is essentially negative, and you have to realize that people don't like to hear that. So what's the whole take on this? True confidence is actually built through repetition, failure, adaptation, and responsibility. So confidence alone is not stable long term. Competence is actually what creates calmness. Real confidence does not face scrutiny. It does not fear scrutiny, and encourage people to build skills first, then your reputation, and then your image last. That is what you need to do, especially if you're in the teaching industry. Even if you're not, in your own life, skill first, reputation second, image last. So I'll leave you with this. The goal is not to appear confident. The goal is to become competent enough so that your confidence no longer has to be performed.